Hello, fellow humans, and welcome to Computer Science for Humans. My name is Reagan, and today we are going to be finishing up our series about using Git and GitHub, and specifically we will be looking at the most common commands that you will need in order to use Git from your computer in pretty much any kind of working environment. If you haven't seen the rest of the videos in the series, I highly recommend you check them out. They're linked down in the description below and up there somewhere as well. Otherwise, let's jump right in. To install it, we are going to do what we talked about earlier, git clone, and then, ooh, that pasted wrong. I'm not sure what I copied, but it wasn't the URL. Let me go back here, copy that URL. And you might have to use Shift Insert to paste, or you can right click and click paste. There we go. Press enter. And this time we see cloning. You will have to sign in. I'm going to sign in with browser. You'll see it brings up this page and you can just authorize. Get credential manager because you want to be authorized to authorize yourself. And now you can see it has cloned the repository. You can tell that it's successful if at the end it says this whole receiving object's 100% done. So now we're actually going to minimize this because we will come back to using this later. And we're going to go to File Explorer again. And you can see now we have the Get Started folder right here. So it's downloaded it for us onto our computer. Now we're going to go through each of these files and actually look at them a little bit. We'll start with the README. You'll notice I'm using Visual Studio Code, and you'll see it's got this hash get started example new Git repository. This is a special notation for basically displaying READMEs. You don't need to worry about it too much for now. Feel free to look into it on your own. I think it's called GitHub markup language. It's basically just a way to make your stuff look fancy when people read it. But you'll see this is exactly what we saw, just with a slightly different formatting on our README when we created the README. So if we come down here to the README, get started is really big. That's what the hash means. It means it's a heading. And then example new Git repository is just this text underneath. So editing this is how you would put stuff into the README. For the sake of making changes, I'm going to go ahead and change just a little bit. This is my change. And I'm going to make sure to save, because if you don't save, obviously your changes won't be there. Now let's look at the license, just so you can see what that kind of ends up as. And this is just a simple text file with the license in it. Each license is different. This one specifically is the unlicensed, like we selected earlier. And it basically just says, you can do whatever you want. I don't care, and I'm not liable for it. Next, we'll look at the git ignore file, which I'm also going to open with Visual Studio Code. And you see this mess. This one can look a lot more overwhelming, and you don't need to worry too much about the details of this. Like I said, it's usually just quite sufficient to use the default git ignore that they have already created for whatever language you're using, in this case JavaScript, but for the purpose of just kind of understanding this. So the main things to know here, this is a comment, which if you're familiar with coding, you'll know that this just is a line of code that's for programmers to read that the computer ignores. So anything that is named logs, it's not going to push to GitHub. GitHub's just going to completely ignore it. If it's something .log, then GitHub will ignore it. If it's this, the star basically means anything. So if it's anything .log, or if it's npm-debug.log anything, then it's just going to be ignored. These are regular expressions. Don't worry about them if you don't know them. That's a topic for another video. Keep an eye out for that one too. And you'll see there's like 500,000 of these things that are basically just the most common files that JavaScript and Node create that you don't want to put onto your GitHub repository because there's no reason to put them there, and they would just clutter things up. Finally, we have the .git folder. Don't worry about that one. It just is basically your Git settings and lets the computer know that this folder is a Git repository. You don't ever want to edit anything in there unless you're doing something super hyper ultra advanced and you know exactly what you're doing and why. Generally, just ignore this folder. It only exists to let your computer know this is a Git repository. So with all of that there, let's go ahead and make just a little bit of code, and then we are going to put that code and the change we made to the README onto GitHub. So all I've done so far is open up that folder in our Git repository inside of Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new file. Hey.javascript. This is going to be a really simple one, not going for anything complicated. This video is about Git, not about JavaScript. And I'm just going to have this be console.log hey. Basically just a hello world. You can do this in any language you want. It's not restricted to JavaScript. I just picked JavaScript because it's super easy and there's not much overhead to it. I'm going to save it, and then I'm going to come to this terminal. Generally, you can use any terminal. I often use the terminal built into Visual Studio Code, but for now, I'm just going to use the min_tty terminal that was opened earlier. And if you do, you'll notice we changed two files. First, we changed the README, and then we made a file called hey.js and put some stuff in it. So if I do git status, whoopsies. First, I have to go into the repository. So we cloned it inside of the CSFH folder, and then we have to go into the CSFH folder into the Get Started folder. And now we are in a Git repository. And you'll notice it now says main, and it's telling us what branch we're on. That's how you can know you're inside of the repository. So if you get this error that says fatal, not a Git repository, you probably just need to use cd to go into the actual file that you downloaded. Now we are going to do git status. And this is the first and simplest git command that you are going to use other than git clone, which we already did. Git status just tells you what things have changed since last time. So right now, you'll see that we have modified the README file, which is true. We made a modification there. And there's one untracked file, which we'll get to in a second, called hey.js. Now, something to understand, GitHub and Git, they use a lot of really fancy terminology for things. Untracked is basically just a fancy way of saying that it's an unsaved change. So if we're going to save the change, there are a few steps to actually get it up onto the GitHub cloud. The first step is to add the file. And what that does is it tells Git on our computer to pay attention to it and get ready to get it onto the cloud. So git add. There are a number of things you can do with the add command, but the most common one, and the one you'll use the most probably, is either --all or dot. They do almost the same thing. Dot adds everything in the folder you're in. --all adds everything. So everything that's red is added when you do --all. So I'm just going to do that because we want both of these changes. And then if I do git status again, you can see the files are green now. Green means Git is paying attention to these and they're kind of saved. What do I mean by kind of saved? The Git terminology for what this is they are added or tracked. Once the files are tracked, that means you can start moving that file onto the cloud. So the first step is to make it from untracked to tracked, or from red to green. Red to green is a lot easier to remember. Now that we've tracked it, we need to basically tell GitHub, or Git rather, that we are committed to this change. So this is in what's called the staging area. It's like, okay, we have this here, do we really want it? Because if you don't, right now it's still easy to get rid of a change. It's just one command, git reset, and the name of the file, which we'll talk about in a bit. So for now, we are content with these changes. This is good. I'm willing to commit these changes so that they are semi-permanent. To do that, we are going to tell Git we are committed by saying git commit. And this command at its core commits these changes to make them, like I said, semi-permanent. Part of a commit is you have to give a message to let people know what changes you've just added. So to do that, you do -m. And if you try to commit without doing the message, you'll get an interesting result. And especially if you have Vim editor, but we'll go over that in a minute. First, we'll just do this one. You got -m, quotes, and then your message. So in this case, modify readme and add hey.js. One thing to note about this, I'm going to do a whole video on this later, but just as a quick note, usually you want your commit message to give you a general idea of what changes were made. There are all sorts of rules that differ from company to company on how exactly you should format your message. If you're just doing stuff for yourself for practice, something like this is totally fine. And then we can press enter, make sure you close the quotes. And I need to let it know who I am, so I'm going to do that. You will probably see this the first time you're using Git. This basically just is asking you to log in on the terminal. We've already logged in on the website for the terminal. Now we have to log into the terminal. It's just two easy commands, and I'll show you how to do them. It's the two that it says right there. So you see run, and then those two commands. We're going to do that. So git config global user.email, and then you would do your email. And then your git config global user.name, and then Computer Science for Humans. For you, this would be whatever name you want associated with your work. So if you're in a workplace, actually a lot of workplaces will probably have rules about this. Usually it's either your work email or just your actual name. So yeah, just be aware that whatever name you put there and whatever email you put there, they are as public as your repository. So if you're sending this out to everyone, you may not want to use your real email. I don't mind, because if you want lessons or something, feel free to contact me through this email. Okay, so hopefully now it should allow us to commit. I'm going to press the up arrow until we're back at the commit message, press enter, and there we go. It committed this time. So now we have committed our change. So what does that mean? That's basically like the save. Now, once it's committed, those changes are saved, but they are only saved on my computer. The cloud, you'll see in just a second, has no idea what's happened. So here I am at the website again. If I refresh the repository, you'll see that the README still says example new Git repository, and there is no JavaScript file. So now what we need to do, we've saved it on our own computer. Now we need to share that save with the cloud server that is GitHub. The way we do that is a command called push. Push just means take my changes and push them somewhere else. Let everyone else who wants to look at the repo also see these changes. Usually you only want to do this when you feel like your changes are ready to be seen, but again, every company has their own requirements about when you do this. Personally, I like to push every time I commit because that encourages you to make sure that your commits work since they are going to where everyone else can use them. But again, that's a topic for another day. So we'll go ahead and do a git push. And with push, you don't have to tell it anything else. You can just say git push, and you should be seeing something like this. If you see an error, try Googling it because usually you can find the errors that way pretty easily, but you should be seeing something like this at the moment. So now what happens if we do git status? You'll notice on branch main, which we know that we're on branch main because that's the only branch. Your branch is up to date with origin main. What that means is that you're up to date. Origin main is the cloud server. So we are up to date. There is nothing to commit. The working tree is clean. That's basically their way of saying there are no changes right now. So if we go back to the website and refresh, now we see hey.js and this is my change. Hopefully you should be seeing this too. And now we've gone through the basics of how you use Git. That's pretty much all there is to it. You create the repo, you clone the repo, you make changes, you add, commit, and push to give those changes back to everybody else so they can get them. The add, commit, push is the part that gets most people. And that's really all there is to it. When you're working by yourself and generally for school, as long as you're not working with other people, this is sufficient. Now, before we go, I do want to leave you with one more command that it's going to be imperative to know if you are going to be working with other people, which is kind of the point of using Git in the first place, and that is the pull command. Pull is what you use when somebody else made a change and you need to pull it onto your computer. I can't show you a perfect example because I'm the only one working on this repo at the moment, but when you're giving changes to other people, you push them up to the cloud, and when you're taking changes that other people have done and integrating them into your project, you pull them down from the cloud. To do a pull, it's actually pretty simple. You just type git pull, press enter, and then the first time, well, for mine, it's already up to date. If you have actual changes that you are trying to pull, then the first time you'll often see something along the lines of something about set upstream origin or something like that, and then it'll say something like try running, and then have like dash dash set upstream branch, and then a whole bunch of other stuff. Usually you can just copy that command that they've just given you, paste it, run it, and then do git pull again, and you should see already up to date. The one thing that's really nice about Git is oftentimes if you are a little bit off, they'll actually suggest the command you need in order to do what you're trying to do. Other than that, you don't really need much else to start using Git pretty much like a pro. 98% of the Git stuff you're going to do is these things, and the only time you need the other really fancy stuff is if something goes terribly wrong, which we'll cover in another video. So to recap what we've learned today, we have installed Git onto our computer. We created a new repository complete with a license, a README, and a git ignore that are appropriate to your project. We cloned that repo down onto our own computer. We then made some changes, added those changes so that Git was paying attention to them, committed those changes so that they were saved on our computer, pushed those changes so that other people could see them on the cloud. Then we kind of ran through pulling other people's changes down onto our computer so that we can use them. And that's basically all you need to know about Git, at least for now. Yes!